I am not a prophet. That's an announcement. I am also, God forbid, not a sociologist. And so I cannot really tell you very much that's well informed about the future. I can only tell you something about observation. I've been around in the Jewish community now, active, teaching, traveling for half a century. I have 3 times, just so you know who I am, I have 3 times walked away from the American Academy, leaving good universities to teach at fly-by-night rabbinical schools of one form or another. My wife says that some guys every few years after a certain age get a little red sports car. I seem to get a little red rabbinical school. The word red in that sentence is mostly about the color ink in the ledger books of those rabbinical schools, but a little bit about the politics of the students as well. And so as I get this, that's where we are. That's who I am. I was a graduate student at Brandeis in the 1960s when we started Chavurat Shalom, which was a great experiment in Jewish education. I taught at Penn for 11 years and then left for the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, which I ran for a number of years. I left there and went back. I had the great honor of receiving what had been my own professor's chair at Brandeis, and I taught at Brandeis for 10 years until we decided to found a rabbinical school at Hebrew College. Those of you who have gotten the English version of this rag, you've all seen the real favorites, which is in Yiddish, but the English translation for Pikers is also around. And there you will see an article about rabbinic education today and how well Hebrew College is doing. It's a first-page article. Take a look at it. And because that article is out and it got put under everybody's door last night, I'll say a little bit about that in the course of things as well. I did this strange career of mine, leaving university several times and going to rabbinical schools, because I am very committed to the enterprise of the Jewish future, to the future of the Jewish people and the future of our collective Jewish enterprise, which to me is a national enterprise and a spiritual enterprise at the same time, and I don't really differentiate between those things. I want to convert the people to my spiritual way of thinking and am involved in both aspects of that. Thank you for squeezing in. I'm sorry the room is small and the chairs are big, and that's what they gave us. If some young people want to come sit on the floor and make some chairs free for people who need them more, my generation, that would be appreciated. Thank you. Thank you very much. Because this is New York, I decided I wanted to tell you a New York story. I want to begin with a story. For whom am I teaching? Who is the student I have in mind when I teach? I've been doing this for a very long time. Take yourselves back, please, to, I believe it was 1971. Remember, anybody old enough to remember that year? 1971. Fordham University, nice Catholic university in the Bronx, you may know. Fordham University announces it was having a day on spiritual teachings in the great traditions of the world. And the theme was going to be the seasons of the year in our spiritual traditions. There were 4 speakers. A wonderful Benedictine brother named David Steindl-Rast, a very good poet, fine sort of contemplative poetry. The head of New York Zen Center, Swami Satchidananda, who was the founder of Integral Yoga, and your humble servant, who was a 31 or 32-year-old, just a little bit out of rabbinical school, but I represented the Jewish mystical tradition. People already knew I was teaching out of the Kabbalistic tradition, Hasidic tradition. Most of the people there were disciples of the Swami. You could tell because they wore white gatkis, and they were about three quarters of the room in weiße gatkis. And so, how do you say gatkis in English? There's no uniforms, I guess, but there's really no good word for it. It's funny uniforms, I guess they translate gatkis. And so, Brother David gave a very beautiful talk about the seasons of the year, Christmas and Easter, and going with Christ from birth to death and the human life cycle. It was very nice. The Swami said, Om Shanti, Om Shanti, Om Shanti, Om, and we chanted for a little while. The head of the Zen Center, he told some stories. The head of the Zen Center got up and said, I have 15 minutes, we will sit. Gesessen, 15 minutes. And I talked about the 2 great cycles of the Jewish calendar, the fall cycle, which is about the personal transformation, and the spring cycle, which is about the national transformation and how they interpenetrate, what it means to stand before the mountain and hear God's word, and all kinds of nice. I think I was pretty good. After the lecture, a young man raises his hand. He's wearing the uniform. He's one of the Swami's Gatka disciples, and he says to me, Rabbi, that's very nice what you said about standing before the mountain and inner hearing and opening the soul, but that's not Judaism, is it? Judaism is really about how God's up there in heaven and he's watching and counting and making a list of the good things you did and the bad things you did, and he's going to punish you if there are more bad things. Isn't that really Judaism? And I look at this kid, nice face, and I think another kid ruined by the Long Island Hebrew schools. And I say to him in my most young rabbi, warm, pastoral way, most of us end our Jewish education when we're 13 years old. And besides, the people who taught us Judaism didn't know very much about Judaism anyway, and we really have to begin again on an adult level. And he smiled and sat down. And he came up to me afterwards and said, I just want you to know I quit such and such black hat yeshiva a year before smicha. So I've carried him around for a very long time. When you ask who I teach for, he's one of the people I teach for. And since you're New Yorkers, and this is a New York story, I thought I would somehow tell you that, to tell you something of what I do, that I have a certain New Yorker, and of course, many more like him in mind, in that you get what's called a higher Jewish education at a very well-known institution of higher Jewish learning in the community, not in the university, but in the community, and that's what you come away with as a young adult. That's what Yiddishkeit is about. It's about how God is watching and is going to punish you, and then that's sort of the beginning and end of the game. So I have been trying to bring a kind of, what shall I call it, spiritual wakefulness and more thoughtful theology to young Jews, especially young rabbis, future rabbis whom I've been teaching in various places. I also teach already ordained rabbis. One of my great privileges in life is teaching rabbis. I teach rabbis because that's what I can do about the Jewish future. I look out of the class of future rabbis and I say, my God, these people are going to be rabbis, in 2040, 2050. They're still going to be that's still going to be part of their career. They're going to be dealing with the problems of that generation. And it somehow is a way into the future. I get there through the past. I am the Jew I am, really, because of my mother's parents. My mother's parents, who were shtetl Yidden essentially, came in the Great Immigration, 1904. But that means they were raised in the 19th century. They were young adults when they came in 1904. They were raised in the shtetl well before the First World War, well before it broke down, Yiddish speakers and part of that world, for various family reasons, because my mother died when I was very young, and they were very heartbroken, and I was close to my grandparents. I was half raised by them. So I am sort of, in some ways, half a generation up, so to speak, in terms of who I am. I'm a third generation American Jew. My parents were all born here after their parents immigrated. Were both born here after their parents immigrated, but somehow I was very close to my grandparents and very close to their world. I was serious. I took high school German in order to learn Yiddish. Not many people take German to learn Yiddish. I took high school German to learn Yiddish. I made the great mistake in high school. One day the teacher called and said, "Die Wochentage," and I said, of course, Donnerstag, Freitag, Shabbos. But, some things you can't get over. I said Thursday, Friday, Shabbos instead of Thursday, Friday, Saturday in German. Some things you can't. So I am the Jew I am because of that connection to my grandparents. When I started teaching at Penn in the 1970s, I looked around and I said, oh my God, I'm teaching fourth generation American Jews, which is to say their grandparents were already born in New York or in Baltimore or in Philadelphia. And they have none of the memories that my grandmother could talk about how we did it in der Heim. And in der Heim meant back home, back in the old country, and there was a real memory of what that world had been, and the carpenter and cabinet maker shul that met in their home, and all those kinds of things, and these were kids whose grandparents were born in New York or Philadelphia, and they might have had some Jewish memories, but mostly they were of trying to assimilate and getting away from their parents' East European background and being embarrassed about it, and they remembered pickles from the barrel like they remembered old baseball games, but they didn't remember much that had real Jewish content, knowledge to it. If they were like my father, his native language was Yiddish, but when he started elementary school, they forbade speaking Yiddish at home. And when I met my father in Israel, and when I went there after college, I had the strange experience of having to translate for him back into his native language, which he could no longer speak because he had repressed it. And so that's something of the world I come from. So looking at those fourth generation American Jews, I said, my God, they have no idea what a Yiddish accent is supposed to sound like. And if they ever heard of gefilte fish, they think it was born in a jar. and they just didn't have that natural affinity to Yiddishkeit I had because of my grandparents, and then reinforced. I lived with a Yiddish-speaking family in Jerusalem for a year before when I first went there, and so on. So I had various ways of reinforcing it. Now, of course, we're teaching fifth and sixth generation American Jews in college. With the exception of the small, very important group of Holocaust survivors' grandchildren, we are mostly talking about fifth and sixth generation, and of course more recent immigrants from the former Soviet Union and so on, but most of the Jewish community are now fifth and sixth generation American Jews, which means there's very little of that kind of memory. Not only fifth and sixth generation American Jews, of course, but blended families. I meet rather few people in that fifth or sixth generation in the non-Orthodox community, which is mostly the community I'm talking about, who don't have non-Jewish relatives in one form or another. I'm among them. If I look at the children and if I look at the grandchildren of my first cousins, even in that more traditional side of the family, my father's side were secular, my mother's side were traditional. Even in that more traditional side, most of the grandchildren of my first cousins will no longer be Jews. That is to say, married to non-Jews and not raising their kids as Jews. And you can see it's gone. What's left are some Jewish-sounding family names, but that's really about what's left in most of my cousins' families. And we are not a unique family in that way, of course. So I look at the generations of American Jews we are now teaching, and I have the great privilege of teaching future rabbis. As I say, I love it. I'm very blessed by it. 10% of our rabbinical students are Jews by choice, people who are not born Jews. They're among our very best and most serious students. And many of our other students are Jews, as I say, who have either a non-Jewish parent or a non-Jewish grandparent or non-Jewish cousins. We are part of that family. I just did a Dvar Torah a week ago for Parshat Yitro, and I said it's worth noticing that before the Torah is given, the non-Jewish relatives come to visit. And we have to remember we're married into their families too. You know, Yitro comes and brings Moses' wife along, very interesting. And the grandchildren who are from a blended family, from a mixed family, it's kind of, we don't like to think mixed marriage goes back that far, but it's worth remembering sometimes. There are people like that who are part of our world. What else can I say about these American Jews we're teaching? They're ethnically not very identifiable. To my very great regret, I do not believe that there is much room in this particular country we live in, a wonderful country for us in many, many ways, but a country that doesn't have much room for ethnicity that is not available in the color of your skin. This country is so obsessed with the question of race, so bitterly divided by the question of race, the race issue remains alive. The census form, which I understand is going to change in 2020, but did not yet change in 2010, the census form asks you, are you African American, Latin American, Filipino American, Asian American, Aleutian Islander, Pacific Islander, or other, parenthesis, Caucasian? Which is to say, if you're Caucasian, you don't have an ethnic identity as far as the census is concerned. It somehow is expected by the third generation, certainly the fourth or fifth, Greek Americans and Jewish Americans and Italian Americans are all going to meet in the Chinese restaurants. And there is no real reason to continue. Why would you continue that ethnicity? We have accepted you as white. We have accepted you as white. We now find, very unlike in the years when I was growing up, Jews marry into very fine Mayflower families, old WASP families, and are completely accepted in most cases. It's only the Jewish family that has Agbas Nefesh, that worries about that. The WASP family is quite accepting of a Jewish son-in-law or Jewish daughter-in-law. And in some ways that's progress. We have to realize how far we've come from the old anti-Semitism. When I was growing up, you would still look at real estate ads in certain suburbs like Wellesley, Mass, for example, or Summit, New Jersey, and the real estate ads would say near two churches. And we all knew that meant no Jews need apply. But I tell my students about that, and they say, really? You're not making that up? That's so far from the memory of young people today. So on the one hand, we have to bless that. You know, we have made it in America. It took a long time until Jews were accepted as that kind of white. So that's the first thing I want to say about these fifth and sixth generation American Jews we're teaching, or the first two things I want to say: non-Jewish relatives, completely comfortable in America, very light ethnic identity, don't really know very much to do with it. I regret it. I want to make that clear. Part of my father's family, the secular side of the family, were active Yiddishists and really believed in it and sent their kids to Camp Boiberik and the Sholem Aleichem schools and so on, and were very committed to that. But it lasted one generation. It lasted one generation because the grandchildren, certainly the great-grandchildren, didn't know what to do with it. There was a great moment, you'll appreciate this. Perth Amboy, New Jersey, my Uncle Abe was the founder of the Yiddish school, the Sholem Aleichem Volks Institute School. When it closed, they sold their property to the local ultra-Orthodox yeshiva. They gave it on the condition that the ultra-Orthodox yeshiva teach one class in Yiddish. It was a sad moment, but a piece of American Jewish history. So I don't think America has very much room for that kind of secular Jewish identity. I would welcome it, but I don't think the JCC can really provide it, even though the JCC movement is trying to beef up the Jewish content and hiring even some of my former students as rabbis and so on, and I'm all for that. But I think what's going to happen is that in the future, the main Jewish institution in this country is going to remain the synagogue. It's going to remain the synagogue for a couple of reasons. When we moved, in my adolescence, you would say, or my post-adolescence, I'm from Newark, New Jersey, by the way, if there are Newarkers here. I'm from... Okay. I was born in St. Joe's in Patterson, but we were Newarkers. Uncle Mike was on the staff, of course. Sorry, I just lost it for a second. Yes, when we moved to the suburbs, we discovered there were real people out there called Protestants. In Newark, I believe there were 3 religions in America: Catholic, Jewish, and Ukrainian Orthodox. I didn't know there were these other people called Protestants. But we moved to the suburbs, and what church do you belong to? Your identity is by your church. Everybody belongs to a church. Most people don't go very often, that's okay. But you belong to a church. The Jewish institution in suburban America became the synagogue. It was the right, respectable form of affiliation to have in this America that portrays itself as a very religious country. In some ways in some ways is hypocritical about that, as we know. But that's the form of social institution that survived in America, and Jews adjusted to it. Jews who in the city, in the old urban neighborhood, thought of themselves as Jews living next to Italians and Irish and Armenians and other ethnic groups, suddenly Will Herberg came along in 1948 or so and wrote the book, Protestant, Catholic, Jew. There are 3 kinds of people in America. They're Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. We are a religious community. He portrayed it as though we were 1/3 of America, which was very impressive looking. And many people bought it, and many anti-Semites used to think we were 1/3, or at least owned 1/3 of America. And we somehow bought into that's our identity. Now, there's an incongruity to that. There's an incongruity for 2 reasons. Part of it is this question of adopting somebody else's form of identity, the synagogue becoming a church, but synagogues were never quite churches. There was always something different. That wasn't a completely good fit. And the fact that by most measures, when they do interviews, the Jewish population is the most secularized part of the American population. When they ask poll questions, more Jews say, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in the afterlife, I don't believe in reward and punishment, and so on, the classic questions. So you have a secular population identified around a religious institution, which is a kind of strange incongruity. The truth is, of course, that population is not quite as secular as it thinks it is. Depends what questions you ask. If you ask, do you believe in God? Certainly, do you believe in the afterlife? You get very high numbers in the Jewish community that say no. If you ask, do you have a Passover Seder? Do you light Hanukkah candles? Do you want to have a Jewish wedding and a rabbi doing it even if you're marrying a non-Jew? Do you want your kid to have a bar bat mitzvah? Do you want to be buried in the Jewish cemetery? You get very high numbers. So exactly what defines secularism, even on the not only on the ethnic question but on the religious question, it seems to me that we are a somewhat less secular people than some of the surveys make us look like we are. So our institution, I think, will remain the synagogue. That's a problem, of course, because what the synagogue does, the synagogue's main activity, the big thing, the synagogue's big event of the week, of course, is the Shabbat service, is tefillah. I have spent much of my life dealing with the question of prayer, dealing with the theology of prayer, dealing with creative liturgy, dealing with, I'm now writing my own commentary on the prayer book. I'm very involved with the question of prayer. I have had students over the years who have done everything you can think of for creative prayer. I've been involved in a wonderful institution called the IJS, the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, training rabbis in meditation who come home to their congregations and teach meditation. And I've been teaching Chassidut to rabbis who are looking for a new spiritual language for Jews. I'm very involved in how to make the act of prayer, not just the text of the prayer book, but the act of prayer meaningful to a population of Jews. There are Jews for whom those things help. That is to say, there are people attracted to the meditation, and people attracted to the Chassidut, and people attracted to a jazz band Friday night once a month in your synagogue, and all kinds of other things. There's also a very large population of Jews, I can't give you numbers, who are not interested. Who just, no matter, you can stand on your head, you can, as the first Hasidim did in Eastern Europe, turn cartwheels in front of the Aron Kodesh. They're still not going to be interested in praying. Because prayer is just alien to them. It's just something they don't know how to do and don't want to do and are essentially just not spiritual types. The question is, what do those people do if the main institution of Jewish affiliation is the synagogue? And I think in thinking about the future of that institution, the future of the community, that's a big question. My answer mostly is that synagogue has to be turned into a Beit Midrash, has to be turned into a place of learning. Because Jews who are not interested in praying are interested in study. That's one of the more amazing things about our Jewish community. Though we are diminishing at the margins, the grandchildren of my cousins are drifting off. My sister's grandchildren will not be Jews. Those who remain have an interest in Jewish learning that is much higher than it was a generation or two ago. Here you are. But here you are also in our Mea classes, in Wexner Heritage classes, in Melton Mini School classes, in synagogue classes, and all kinds of opportunities for Jewish learning. First of all, learning is something Jews love to do for a long time. We are now in a Jewish community where you have 90% rates of college graduates, huge numbers of college graduates, huge numbers of people with advanced degrees. So approaching people on an intellectual level and giving them an opportunity for learning is something there's a great hunger for. Jews have a tremendous sense of embarrassment about the gap between their master's degrees or doctorates or professional degrees and the fact that they are ignoramuses in Jewish life. It's a terrible embarrassment for a Jew who thinks of him herself as literate to get up and read off that thing and say Baruch Atah, for when they come up for an aliyah, because they're you know the word I'm looking for, they're illiterates. They're illiterates when it comes to Hebrew, illiterates when it comes to Judaism. And how can an educated person, an intelligent person like me be an illiterate? And especially for women who weren't given the opportunity for Jewish education. Yes, I am who I am because that grandmother, that traditional grandmother who was something of a battle axe, insisted that there be a bar mitzvah for every boy, but my sister never got a day of Jewish education because nobody cared that girls have anything. And so my sister is a Jew boo, and a wonderful human being, but never had a day of Jewish education. One of the books you'll see there is dedicated to my sister. This is the Jewish education you never got, and that's part of the situation too. So I think appealing to people on the level of education, the level of learning, is the way to do it. I see a tremendous interest in learning, whether it's Talmud learning and Chavrusa, or whether it's Torah learning, or whether it's creative midrash, or whether it's Jewish literature learning or Jewish music learning. It all belongs. I would like to see the synagogue as crowded and busy on Tuesday night, which is Beis Medrash night, as it is on Shabbos morning, which is davening morning. Or if it's a Reform synagogue, make Shabbos the day of Jewish learning. Make it a festival of Jewish learning day. In a conservative synagogue, you might have to worry about writing and other details. But in a more liberal synagogue, turn Shabbos into a day of Jewish learning. Because it's a great hunger for learning. And part of that hunger is a spiritual hunger. There is a seeking that's been very much a part of this generation's experience. We all know the jokes about the Swami who says all my students are Jewish and the various versions of that, but it's not just a joke. There is, I think, in our part of the population, partly because of the fact that we're urban and intellectual and so on, but partly, I think, because of our Jewish story, there's a tremendous spiritual hunger. I can't go as far as my dear friends and much missed mentor Reb Zalman could, who was able to say it was the neshamas of all those who died in the Holocaust that had no place to go and wandered around the world and entered into the souls of American Jews and made them hungry for Yiddishkeit. I can't say that without saying it in somebody else's name because it's just not my style, but I wanted to convey it anyway because it somehow is there. And so I find myself educating rabbis, and the thing I want to give future rabbis more than anything else is what Eastern European Jews call avos Torah, is a love of learning, a love of Jewish learning, in the sense that Jewish learning is an exciting enterprise and something you want to share with people, and that you want to involve people in and sort of bring them into the Beis Medrash and bring them into the world of learning. Learning, of course, in an interactive way where what they have to say is part of it and is important. So that's a big piece of what I think will happen in the Jewish future, has to happen in the Jewish future for us to survive. I want to talk about the issue of Jewish identity a little, but I'm going to eventually open this up for dialogue. I promise to leave room for that. When I was a kid, Jewish identity was taken for granted. We lived in a pretty tough white ethnic neighborhood in Newark, and what are you, kid, when you got stopped on a street corner by a bunch of other kids? They had the right answers were Polish or Slovak or German. The answer that got you a bloody nose was Jewish. That was still, We didn't live in the Weequahic district. My dad was a leftist, was a liberal, and believed in living in an ethnically mixed district, so we lived in Clinton Hill. Dad was in the faculty at Weequahic High, but we did not live in the Jewish ghetto neighborhood because my dad was a liberal. Right. I understand. That's why we had a fight in our part of Newark. I know. Philip Roth didn't have that experience. Jewish identity was taken for granted. The question is, what were you going to do with it? We live in a world now in this fifth, sixth generation where identity is something you take on and put off. You can choose your identity factors, and they may not be constant identity factors over the course of your lifetime. So I build my identity around the fact that I'm a New Englander, a Red Sox fan, and I love hip-hop music. Those are the things I really care about. That's my identity. The fact that my last name happens to be Goldberg is not of much interest to me. And that represents two of my four grandparents, it's true, and the others are Irish, but that's not important to me that I'm a Goldberg. What's important to me is that I'm a New Englander and a Red Sox fan and a hip-hop music person. Now, in the values of America, people will criticize me. Well, why isn't your gender identity an important part of it? That one somehow kind of has to be. All right, so I'm a lesbian New Englander, Patriots fan, hip-hop lover. But the Jewish part is something I might choose, but I might not choose. And maybe I will choose the Irish quarter of my family to identify with, and there is no punishment for that. There's nothing wrong with that. There may be something wrong with ignoring your gender piece, but there's nothing wrong, quote, in the value system of our society, I'd say, with ignoring your ethnic piece. It's kind of cute that you're interested in it. Isn't that nice, you know? He went to a lecture on Yiddish or something like that, went to a Jewish concert, but don't do it too often. And that's because you are, after all, we know who you really are. You're one of us. You're a real American. You're part of us. So if you become too different, too involved with that, you somehow are checking out of our complicated patchwork, ambivalent identity. And maybe in a couple of years you'll outgrow that, and you're being a fan of Italian cooking will become more important than you being a fan of Jewish culture. That somehow is how identity seems to go in this generation. It's easier to step in and step out. It becomes so complicated by the fact that you have a mixed ethnic background and you may have a partner who is of a different ethnicity and a different religious tradition and therefore is not very comfortable with your being too much involved with this one. And so that's where we are, I think. That's where we are. And how we preserve ourselves in the face of that and pass on this sense of continuity is not a simple question to answer. At the same time, I look at Jews I talk to, and you could be the group I'm going to spend a weekend with in Phoenix, Arizona in a couple of weeks. You could be the group I meet other places. And I ask, what do you really care about? What mitzvah are you really committed to? There's only one mitzvah everybody seems to be committed to, shows up, and that is the mitzvah of Vishinantam Levanecha. We have something we have to pass on. I must pass it on to my children. And if I don't pass it on to my children, I feel a terrible sense of emptiness and failure. I'm sorry, hit the mic. I feel a terrible sense of emptiness and failure. That's why mixed marriage is so hard for Jews. Because I'm not going to have Jewish grandchildren. Oh my God. That means I somehow failed to pass it on. Even if the rich soup of Jewish life has become thin and watery, and you have no content to pass on, you don't know what you want to pass on, I have to pass it on. And I will feel a sense of failure if I didn't pass it on. So therefore I ship my kid off to Hebrew school or to a Jewish summer camp or to an after-school program or to a Sunday school or whatever it is. Maybe they will do what I couldn't do in passing it on. And of course, if those teachers have any brains, they'll come back and say, it has to be in the home. And this has to be about family education and educating the parents and making them part of it and doing things at home. And, you know, I'm happy to tell you that my daughter has now joined the board of a Jewish organization. She's at the board of her daughter's Sunday school, so there is hope in the world. A daughter who wanted nothing to do with it, rabbi's daughter who wanted nothing to do with it for quite a few years, is now in the board of a Jewish organization. I'm still digesting that one. Thank you. So what do we have to offer? What do we have to say? As I said, there's a selection of books out there, but I want to tell you about this new one. This is a new little book I just finished. Judaism's 10 Best Ideas, a Brief Guide for Seekers. This book is addressed to that generation, the sort of the why be Jewish people. I did not write this book for you. I wrote it for your grandson who's going off to college or your daughter-in-law who's thinking about converting. It's a book to give out. I urge you, it's cheap. Take a few copies to give out to those people in your life. I tried to ask, so what do we really have to say to the world? Why is this tradition worth holding on to? For me, that is mostly has to be in spiritual terms, because that's the way I think. It's the kind of neshama I am and the kind of language I speak. But I want to tell you a little bit about some of it. The first chapter is about simcha, is about joy, is about a religion that's about joy and about the joy of Jewish life, and about doing Jewish life in a way that increases happiness in people's lives and that brings joy to people. And I write it thinking about people, even some of them Jews, but I'm thinking more about some of my Catholic friends who have been brought up with a burden of religion is about a terrible burden of guilt. And this yeshiva student whom I began with, who thought about religion is about God up there taking account and writing down your sins. I come enough out of the Hasidic world or a neo-Hasidic world to say that Avodas Hashem b'simcha, that serving with joy, and that joy, the sense of serving is a transformative and joyous experience, and that you can have a religious life that is about enhancing happiness in your life, is what is part of the message we have to offer and part of what we want to bring to the world. And that means, of course, we can't hit people over the head with it. It means we have to do it in the joy-inducing way. But we had a good Shabbos here together, and I think there was a lot of joy. And I think you can come away from a weekend like this thinking, yeah, Judaism is about being more joyous and a happy embrace of a tradition. I'm not going to read all 10 chapters, I promise, but I'm going to read 2 more. There's a chapter about Tselem Elohim. If you ask me what we have to teach the world, what does Judaism still have to teach that's important? I go back to this wonderful debate that Rabbi Akiva and his friend Ben Azai had in the 2nd century. It's found in the Talmud Yerushalmi and the Darim for those who want the footnote. What is the most basic rule of Torah? Klal Gadol BaTorah. What's the most basic rule? What does Torah come to teach? Rabbi Akiva says, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha ze Klal Gadol BaTorah. We used to sing that when I was a kid, but love your neighbor as yourself. That's the most basic rule of Torah. And Ben Azai comes along and says, I know a more basic rule than that. He says, B'yom asot Hashem Elokim et ha'adam b'tzelem Elohim bara otam zachar u'nekeva bara otam. On the day when God created human beings, male and female, He created them all in God's image. And that's the more basic rule of Torah. That debate is very, very interesting and very formative for me. Ben Azai is criticizing his friend Akiva, I think, for two reasons. Love your neighbor as yourself can too easily be restricted to re'acha shehu kamocha, which means to only Jews, or to only from Jews, or to only Reformed Jews like me, but not those Orthodox Jews who everybody knows are unethical, or not those kinds of Jews over there who don't believe in God, or not those Jews over there who are right-wing, fooey. It can be too easily defined to what's called unsere Yidden, our kinds of Jews, and it can be exclusively Jews. When Ben Azai says the more basic principle is Tzelem Elokim, that goes back to Adam. That goes back to the creation. It automatically has to include everybody. The Talmud comments on it and says, Lama nivra Adam yechidi, why was only one human being created at the beginning? Shelo yomar Adam Abba gadol me'avicha, so that nobody can say to anyone else, my father was greater than yours. That's bedrock Jewish ethics. That's something we have to still say to the world. And the world doesn't know it well enough. It can be said in other languages. I'm not saying we're the only people who recognize human dignity, but we have a sense that every human being is not only an image of God, but a unique image of God. You're an image of God like none other that's ever existed. My favorite Hasidic story is Reb Nachman's tale of the portrait of the king. You can find it several places in my work. I comment on it. I have a book called Seek My Face. The whole book is a comment on that tale in some ways, where every person has to bring back a unique portrait of the king at the end of life, because that's a portrait of the Rebbeinu Shalom of God that only that person could create, because you have a unique soul, a unique sense of what you have to do in life. So that's one reason why Ben Azai is arguing with Rabbi Akiva and says, no, we have our message is not just love your neighbor, but is every person is the divine image. The other is, love is a very hard standard to set up on people. There are some people it's very hard to love. And even though I can't love them, I still have to admit they're Tzelem Elokim. I still have to admit they're the image of God. The state of Israel has been given some very difficult neighbors, in case you haven't noticed. Right? If the standard is going to be love, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy to love across that frontier. It wasn't easy to love across the frontier in the Ukraine, right, or Litauen, where my grandparents came from. It was not easy. My grandfather, and mother's father came from a world with two kinds of people in the world, Yidden and Goyim. Yidden reden Yiddish and Goyim reden Goyish. Jews speak Jewish and Goyim speak Goyish. And Yidden haben find Goyim and Goyim haben find Yidden. Jews hate Goyim and Goyim hate Jews. And that's the way it was. It was completely taken for granted. Right. That's the completely taken for granted. He was an orphan because some drunken peasant killed his father when he was 3 months old, and he was raised as a yosem, because that's the way it was, and nobody prosecuted them, of course, and there wasn't a pogrom, wasn't the Holocaust. It was just some drunken peasant killed a Jew, and he grew up in that world where, of course, we hate each other because that's all there is. Thank God we live in a very different world. Anyway, so I'm going to say something else about that. So therefore, love is too high a standard. But treating people with decency, treating people as a Tzelem Elokim, even when you can't love them, is something we Jews have to say. I want to say something that takes me onto this tangent, and that is, because my grandparents came from that world and because they were so important to me, I also know very well, if I were to give my grandchildren exactly the religion my grandparents gave me, I would be committing a terrible crime. Right? If I were to pass on to my grandchildren that they should hate Goyim the way my grandfather, right? Thank God that's not the world they live in. We live in a world of all kinds of people, including some of their non-Jewish relatives, etc., right? Of course not. Of course not. It's evolving, right? What we have to pass on to the next generation, we will not pass on successfully unless we transform it, unless we make it amenable to that generation. Look what's happened in the period of our lifetimes. Look at women's participation fully in Jewish life. That's a tremendous revolution, a tremendous improvement of the product that we're passing on to our grandchildren. It's ridiculous to pass it on to them as it was passed to us from Eastern Europe without change. Style of leadership? The oligarchy of the wealthy who run the community? We wouldn't do that in America, would we? Of course not. The way the shtetl was run by the rich people. Of course we wouldn't do that in America because we're democratic Jews, right? So of course it has to be changed, improved, verteidigt, verbessert by our generation in order to pass it on, because that's the only kind of Yiddishkeit that's going to work for that next generation, if it is creatively transformed in that way. And that's why I teach in the kinds of places I do, teaching people to love the tradition and teaching them to fall in love with it in such a way that they will do creative and interesting things with it. Those of you who have the traditional education will remember the story, the mashal that somebody in the Talmud brings about the king who gives two of his servants flax and wheat to take care of for him, right, and goes away for a long time. And one of them bakes bread and makes the garments, and the other just tries to preserve the wheat and flax, and they get rotten, and the king comes back, and you got to do something with this tradition. You got to make something out of it, which means you've got to be creative with it, and got to find what has to be done with it. The one other thing I'll say from the book, the rest of these 10 I'll talk about, and then I'll wind up and ask for questions, which I should have done a while ago already. The last one I want to talk about is, I call it here, Torah, the people in the book, text and interpretation. There I was going to teach at rabbinical school one day, and I walk out of my house, and right in front of my house in Philadelphia, somebody has the terrible chutzpah to park a pickup truck with a bumper sticker on it. The bumper sticker said, "God said it, I believe it, and that settles it." Now, you can imagine a pickup truck, of course. Stereotypes. I walked into class and I said, "This is not a Jewish bumper sticker." Actually, I said, "Goyish cup." This is not a Jewish bumper sticker. I said, we would say, even very pious, traditional Orthodox Jews would say, "God said it, I believe it." Now let's talk about what it means. Right? That has been our approach for a long time. We have never been a fundamentalist tradition. Although now I'm sorry to say there are people coming toward orthodoxy who are recent Balei Tshuva, who are bringing a certain kind of fundamentalism in that isn't native to the tradition. Because when the Midrash was able to look at a pasuk and say, "Davar acher, davar acher, davar acher," here's another meaning, and they're all true, they're all legitimate. And we're able to say there's a pshat level, and there's a remez level, and there's a sod level, and it's true on all those levels at once. And the fact that psychoanalysis was a Jewish science because we understood there's a truth of consciousness and a truth of a deeper consciousness, and they have something to say to one another, ... I don't have to finish all those sentences for you. That's always been whom we've been. What we do with text, which is to say reinterpret creatively, and there's a wonderful phrase in the rabbis use sometimes about a radical rereading of a text, sarsehu v'darshehu. You know what that means? What's the word? Say that in English for me, somebody? Castrate it and interpret it. You interpret it by castrating it. Make it into something completely different, like a saris. Sarseu v'dasheu. You castrate it and reinterpret it. So you take it and cut it, as it were, off, and it means something very different. So a classic example I'll give you, then I'll shut up. A classic example I'll give you is the moment, the great holy moment. Moses at the top of Mount Sinai, and he's asking for the forgiveness of the Jews. And suddenly a voice comes out and says, "Hashem, Hashem, El Rachum V'Chanun Rechapayim V'Rav Chesed V'Emet," and goes on to say, "V'nakeh lo yinakeh. Poked avon avot al banim al shileshim v'al rebeim." God, it will surely not cleanse, but will visit the sins of the fathers on the children, down to the third and fourth generation of the guilty. And then the rabbis came along, made that a text for every slicha, for every penitential service ever said in the synagogue. You know it mostly from Yom Kippur, but it's there on every tainus and on every fast day and so on. And they took that text and they chopped it off in the middle. They said, right? V'chata v'nakeh, God will surely cleanse. Nakeh v'nakeh was v'nakeh lo yinakeh, he indeed will not cleanse. And they said no to that text. They said, you want it in shul? That's the way it's going to be. V'chata v'nakeh, God will cleanse sin. And they chopped that text off and said, this is what it's going to mean in our synagogue. That's a very daring act to take not only a pasuk, but the pasuk spoken by the word of God, and to say, we're going to end it here, because we want the meaning to be different. That kind of courage, the kind of courage of interpretation, is something we once had. We lost a lot of because the rabbis came along and said, well, this has been decided already, that's been decided, this has been decided, you have less and less room. We have to open that up again. There has been, in the last 50 years, a wonderful rebirth of Midrash. You can see it in the Jewish women's movement, you can see it in the Chavurah movement, you can see it in Jewish Renewal, other places. A wonderful rebirth of Midrashic creativity, so we can again say, it means this and this and this and this, and they're all true, and therefore there's room for your reading as well. We have the wonderful advantage in our rabbinical school of being next door neighbors to a Christian seminary. We are located on a hill in Newton, Mass, which since 1825 has been called Seminary Hill. The oldest independent Christian seminary, not part of a university in the country, is Newton Seminary, now Andover Newton, which is our next door neighbor. They sold the land to Hebrew College for our building, having no idea at the time that Hebrew College was going to open a rabbinical school. We have become very good friends and dialogue partners, and one of the fascinating things is their students seeing how we read text. They've never seen this, that you can read a biblical text and play with it and reinterpret it and count the number of words and count the number of letters and come out with a whole different meaning of it, and that this is true and that's true at the same time. They are just bowled over by the way we reread and transform our tradition and keep it alive. So those are some of the things I think we have to say and have to offer in this new American mix, to convince our people that it's worth staying home enough so that you can learn some of those things in order to have them to offer. That's the name of the game, and it's what I have given much of my life to, and I invite you along on that journey. Thank you. Thank you. Every human being in the world is a product of 2 parents and 4 grandparents and 8 great-grandparents. And every human being in the world, in Yirtzeh Hashem, is going to be a parent of kids, or more or less most people will raise kids, or will be an uncle of nieces and nephews, let's say, to expand it, or will have children in their lives, the next generation, and those children will have children, and there'll be grandchildren, and there'll be great-grandchildren, and so on. That's who we are. Each of us is a nexus, taking all those generations down and then giving all those generations out. That's one way to look at who we are. That's true of every human being. Jews are a little more self-conscious about that, partly because of a legacy of persecution and a minority status for a long time. We've been a struggling minority for a long time. One of my great mentors, whom I never met, but a professor at Brandeis, where I was a student, was Shimon Ravadovich, who wrote a famous article called "The Ever-Dying People." You can imagine the content of the article, right? We are ever. Each generation is the last. But Sheva Singer used to say in lectures, if I learned one thing, they asked him, how can you write in a dying language? He said, if there's one thing I learned from Jewish history, there's a big difference between dying and dead. And so that's who we are. I think it's a legacy that goes back to that goes back to the Holocaust especially, of course. But I think it goes all the way back to Yetzias Mitzrayim. I think the fact that we raise our kids going to a Seder and hearing that we were slaves and learning how you're supposed to treat people because we were slaves and therefore don't do this or that to strangers because we were slaves, and that there's a memory, there is an ancient memory of suffering, and something came out of it. We came out of Egypt and we got to Sinai, and even people who don't believe in Torah Sinai, I'm not being a literalist at all, I'm being very metaphorical here. We came out of Egypt and we came out with a moral code. Wow. That's something very impressive about our history, and that's something my kids should know something about. I think it's related to the fact that Jews with a lot of money still mostly vote Democratic and mostly support generous social welfare programs. And you look, I'm proud to say, you look at human rights organizations around the Western world and look at the names on the boards, and you see a hugely disproportionate number of Jewish names because, I'm sorry? I see it from Yetzias Mitzrayim. I absolutely see it going all the way back to Mitzrayim. I think that that Tselem Elokim, the sense that you treat human beings decently because we were slaves in Egypt, is something that the Jewish neshama still knows very well, even when it doesn't think it does. We didn't talk about Israel at all. It was on my notes somewhere to talk about Israel, but I didn't get to it. One of the things I wanted to say is a fact of American Jewish life, a generation from now, I'm afraid, is that the alienation between Israel and American Jews is going to be greater than ever. Partly because American Jews are very committed to liberal democracy and its values. And you watch American Jews this past summer, around Ferguson and around Eric Garner and so on, how most American Jews felt so upset and disgusted by things happening in America and so identifying with victims. To the degree that Israel becomes or allows itself to be something other than a liberal democracy for all its citizens and all those under its rule, that American Jewish community in the next generation is going to be more and more deeply alienated from Israel. And Israel has to realize that is not about Hasbara. It is not about these kids are disloyal, they're not real Jews. It's about the actions of the Israeli government. And they have to realize that and therefore do something about those actions. I'm very I'm a committed far left-wing Zionist for many, many decades. Committed Zionist, but very much critical of lots of things going on in the territories and inside the Medina. As I say that as a person who's been there twice this year, and as many of my dearest friends and associations are there, and many of my books come out in Hebrew now. Nothing in Jewish history prepared us for having power and ruling over other people. We are so good at being victims. We are so well prepared for it. I mean, Jewish history, one of the most amazing things about Jewish history is that we were thinking about Galut before it ever happened. The story of Gerusha Adam Gan Eden, which is a story about universal human Galut, was at least in its oral versions present before Churban Bayit Rishon, before Galut Bavel, before the first temple was destroyed. We were already thinking about exile. By the time the first temple was destroyed, we had these huge passages in Vayikra and Dvarim and in the prophets about exile. Long before we had 2,000 years of exile, and we were so well prepared to handle exile. And that's when we met with the Dalai Lama. I didn't go to Dharamsala, but I was in the pre-meeting in that famous conversation with Dalai Lama. The only thing he wanted to learn from the Jews was, how did you survive? We've been exiled from Tibet since 1959 and we're falling apart. How are you here 2,000 years later? We were so well prepared by our history and our theology for exile and victimhood. We have no preparation at all for power and ruling over non-Jews, and we're doing a terrible job of it. We are doing a terrible. Well, yes, the Maccabees. Well, they conquered the Edomites, and they didn't do very well with the Edomites. And then we had Herod coming out of the Edomites, probably because we forced our Judaism on the Edomites. We converted them. It wasn't such a good paradigm. And the Hashmonaim became what they became, and the rabbis hated the memory of them. And so we're not doing a very good job of that because our history. By the way. The history of Islam never prepared Muslims to live as a minority in a non-Muslim country. The history of Islam prepared them for domination and for a caliphate and for how do you have an Islamic state and then how do you treat the minorities in that Islamic state. That you as a Muslim would be a minority in a Christian country and have to deal with Jews who are living next door who are also fellow minorities. Nothing in Islam, in the Islamic tradition, prepared them for that, and that's one of the reasons they are so discombobulated being in Golas, so to speak, and we are so discombobulated in being a state. That does not alleviate us of responsibility, but it explains part of what's going on. I love college kids, and I spent much of my life. I moved back and forth from universities to rabbinical schools, but I sit on every interview committee that I can for future rabbinical students. Most of the kids are just out of college, so I know that scene well. A good number of our graduates are now working in Hillel and love working in Hillel, and I encourage it. And listen, it's a great formative time of life, as you know. Now, I liked the old Hillel. I liked Hillel that attracted, I would say, somewhat unconventional and more intellectual rabbis who were rabbi directors in the old days and who spent their Hillel careers developing important relationships with really interesting seeking students. I think Hillel became too bean counting as far as I was concerned, too much how many students have you had in the door and how many have been in how many Hillel programs. I think set aside some bean counting is my advice to National Hillel, since you're asking. I think some of that is changing now. Set aside the bean counting and find really interesting, creative people. There's so many out there. Young Jewish professionals, people in this room, young Jewish future professionals, whether they get rabbinical degrees or Jewish education degrees, who should be on campus. The Senior Jewish Educator Program has been wonderful, I think, and been very successful, and bringing people themselves who are just a few years out of college, who still have the closeness in age and the freshness. Content. Don't mess around with Jewish squash courts and Jewish volleyball. Content. So, listen, I've spent much of my life as a translator of Jewish sources. I have Hasidic texts one can teach them, but I have little books like this that are made for college kids, and that's what I say. So yes, expose them to really thinking people with really good content. Thank you all. It's been wonderful.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.